Some stories don't begin with sirens or shouted commands. They begin with a pause, the kind of quiet that settles into a room after everyone has gone home, when the lights hum softly and the walls seem to listen. This is a story about a Navy SEAL named Ethan Brooks and an aging German Shepherd who refused to stop watching the door about what happens when the uniform comes off and staying starts to matter. If you've ever ended a long day wondering when you stopped being needed, then you already understand part of Ethan's journey. This isn't a story about glory or headlines. It's about quiet faith, loyal hearts, and the small choices people make when no one is watching, choices that still change everything. Snow fell over Spokane, Washington, not violently, but with a quiet persistence, as if the city itself were trying to forget something it could not name. Ethan Brooks noticed the snow the way a man notices an old scar, without surprise, without comment. At 42, he carried himself with the controlled economy of someone who had spent most of his adult life minimizing motion. He was tall, just over 6 feet broad through the shoulders, but no longer carved sharp the way he'd been in his early Navy SEAL years. Time and injury had softened him in places he did not speak about. His jaw was angular, perpetually shadowed by a trimmed but uneven beard that he forgot to shave more often than not. A pale scar ran from the edge of his left eyebrow into his hairline, a souvenir from a breach gone wrong in Fallujah, one of many moments that taught him how quickly certainty could collapse. His eyes were gray-blue, steady, observant, and distant in a way that made people unsure whether he was judging them or simply somewhere else entirely. He had been back in Spokane for 6 months, yet the house still felt temporary, like a forward operating base built with civilian furniture. The walls were bare. The silence lingered too long after every sound. Ethan slept lightly, waking at the smallest disturbance, his body reacting before his mind had time to catch up. The war had not followed him home loudly. It followed him quietly, settling into his habits, his posture, the way he always chose a seat with his back to the wall. The only constant in the house was Shadow. Shadow was a 9-year-old German Shepherd, sable-coated with black along the spine and a graying muzzle that betrayed his age. His build was powerful but no longer explosive, muscles dense, rather than sharp movements, measured rather than reckless. One ear stood perfectly upright, while the other carried a slight bend at the tip, the result of an old training injury that never quite healed right. Shadow's eyes were dark and intelligent, the kind that did not beg for affection but accepted it with quiet dignity. He had been trained for combat detection and search operations, but more than that he had learned Ethan, his breathing patterns, his silences the nights when sleep would not come. Shadow did not pace or whine when Ethan woke at 3 a.m. He simply rose, crossed the room, and lay down where Ethan could see him. It was his way of saying, "I'm still here." That afternoon, Ethan clipped the leash to Shadow's collar and stepped outside the cold, biting through his jacket. He needed to take Shadow to St. Luke's Medical Center for a routine evaluation required by the Veterans Affairs program. Nothing serious, just paperwork and checkups. Ethan disliked hospitals. The smells, the fluorescent lighting, the way time behaved differently inside them. But Shadow needed it, and Ethan had learned long ago that duty didn't care about comfort. The drive into downtown Spokane was slow snow, muting the usual city noise. Ethan's hands rested loosely on the steering wheel, scarred knuckles pale against the dark leather. He caught his reflection in the windshield at a stoplight and barely recognized the man looking back. Not the operator he used to be, not entirely a civilian either. Something unfinished caught between definitions. St. Luke's rose out of the snow like a block of quiet endurance, windows glowing against the gray afternoon. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee gone stale. Shadow walked at Ethan's left side, close but not crowding, nails clicking softly against the tile. Heads turned as they passed, some curious, some cautious. But Shadow ignored them all, focused, professional, calm. That was when Sarah Mitchell first entered Ethan's awareness. She stood behind the intake desk, mid-30s average height, with a slim, almost fragile frame that contrasted with the steadiness of her movements. Her auburn hair was pulled back into a low ponytail, strands already escaping, despite the early hour of her shift. Freckles dusted her pale skin, especially across the bridge of her nose, and there were faint shadows beneath her green eyes, the kind earned through long nights and too many double shifts. She wore her scrubs neatly but without vanity. Sleeves rolled slightly, as if always ready to move. When she spoke, her voice was calm, low, and controlled, carrying an undercurrent of warmth that suggested patience rather than cheer. Shadow stopped. Not abruptly, not aggressively, he simply sat at Ethan's side and fixed his gaze on Sarah with focused attention. Ethan felt the subtle change immediately. Shadow did not do this without reason. Sarah noticed too. Her eyes flicked down to the dog and a small surprised smile touched her mouth. "Well," she said gently, stepping closer and crouching slightly to Shadow's level. "Without invading his space, you look like someone who's seen a few things." Shadow remained still, ears forward, breathing slow. Sarah extended her hand just enough for him to smell, not touching unless invited. Shadow leaned forward a fraction, accepting her presence. Ethan watched the interaction, something tight in his chest shifting unexpectedly. He had learned to trust Shadow's instincts more than his own. The dog did not attach himself to people easily. When he did, it meant something. "He doesn't usually stop for strangers," Ethan said, his voice rough from disuse. Sarah looked up at him, meeting his gaze without flinching. There was no pity there, no curiosity sharpened into judgment, just acknowledgement. "Maybe he's not stopping," she replied softly. "Maybe he's checking in." Shadow lay down at her feet as if the decision were already made. Ethan didn't know it yet, but that small, quiet moment, the dog choosing to stay, was the first crack in a wall he had spent years building. And Spokane's winter patient and unrelenting had only just begun. By the time Ethan Brooks left St. Luke's Medical Center, the snow had thickened, softening the city into a blur of white and sodium-lit streets, but something from inside the building followed him out into the cold. It wasn't a sound or a voice. It was the memory of Shadow refusing to move the way the German Shepherd had lowered himself at Sarah Mitchell's feet, as if the decision had been made long before either human noticed. Ethan drove home with the radio off his thoughts, circling the moment like a patrol route he couldn't abandon, replaying Sarah's calm hands, her steady eyes, the absence of fear in her posture. Shadow rode upright in the passenger seat. Against every old regulation, Ethan still half obeyed, watching the world slide past the windshield with alert stillness. Ears pricked, body quiet, as though waiting for a signal only he could hear. Sleep did not come easily that night. Ethan lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, feeling the old tension coil beneath his ribs, the familiar sense that something unresolved had shifted its weight and was now pressing closer. Shadow eventually rose from the doorway and settled beside the bed, his warm flank anchoring Ethan to the present. Morning arrived gray and late, and with it a call from the VA reminding Ethan of paperwork deadlines he barely heard. What stayed with him was the memory of the hospital's hum, the smell of antiseptic, and the look on Sarah's face when Shadow chose her. He told himself it was coincidence, instinct misread through nostalgia. Still, by early evening, he found himself clipping Shadow's leash again and turning the truck back toward St. Luke's under the pretense of a longer walk, a different route, a coincidence he could justify if needed. Inside the hospital, the energy had changed. The day staff had thinned, replaced by the quieter, sharper rhythm of the night shift. Fluorescent lights hummed with a persistent fatigue, and the corridors carried the low echo of rolling carts and muted conversations. Sarah Mitchell stood near the nurse's station, sleeves rolled higher than the day before, auburn hair escaping its tie in tired curls. Up close, Ethan noticed the way she carried herself, shoulders back, not from confidence, but from discipline, as if collapse were an option she simply did not allow. Her skin was pale with a constant flush, at the cheeks freckles standing out beneath the harsh lighting, and her eyes, green, steady, held a weariness she masked with professionalism. When she saw Ethan and Shadow, her expression softened in recognition rather than surprise. Shadow did not hesitate this time. He walked directly to her tail, low, but wagging once, then sat, gaze lifted as if waiting for instruction. "Looks like you've been cleared for repeat visits." Sarah said quietly, crouching again, careful to stay within the dog's comfort. Ethan shrugged, embarrassed by the pull that had brought him back. "He doesn't usually make decisions twice," he replied. Sarah's mouth curved into a small, knowing smile. "Neither do most people," she said, then straightened as a gurney rushed past, pushed by a man Ethan had not seen before. The man was broad and heavy-set, late 40s, with a shaved head and a beard peppered gray, moving with the efficiency of someone who had learned to function on too little rest. Sarah murmured, "That's Mark Delaney, trauma charge nurse. Built like a wall heart to match, but he's been doing this so long, he forgets how to slow down." Mark glanced over, nodding once at Ethan and Shadow, eyes assessing, but kind, then disappeared into the trauma bay. The night unfolded in fragments. A young woman with a fractured wrist, sobbing more from fear than pain, an elderly man struggling to breathe, a teenager stitched and sent home with a lecture he pretended not to hear. Ethan stayed near the wall, out of the way, a habit ingrained by years of learning when presence helped and when it interfered. Shadow remained near Sarah, adjusting his position each time she moved, never crowding, never leaving. Around midnight the tone shifted. Radios crackled, voices tightened, and the doors burst open with controlled urgency. A construction worker was wheeled in unconscious, dusted with concrete blood drying dark along his hairline. He was in his early 30s, lean-build, work boots, still on his feet, hands rough with calluses. Sarah moved instantly, voice calm but sharp, as she issued instructions, her earlier softness replaced by focused authority. Shadow stiffened. Ethan saw it immediately, the dog's posture changing muscles, locking nose, lifting, as if catching a scent that didn't belong to the room. Shadow stepped forward, then stopped short of the gurney, a low sound vibrating in his chest. Ethan's instincts surged, the old training surfacing without invitation. He raised a hand not to stop the dog, but to acknowledge the signal. Sarah noticed too. Her gaze flicked from Shadow to the patient, then to Ethan. "He's reacting?" she said, not as a question. Ethan nodded. "He does that when something's wrong," he replied, choosing his words carefully. The monitors showed unstable but acceptable numbers. A junior resident, pale and tense, shook his head. "CT's clear. No internal bleeding," he said, voice brittle with the need to be right. Shadow did not move. He circled once, then lay down near the man's chest head, angled toward the ribs, breathing slow but intent. Sarah hesitated a fraction of a second that might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, then made a choice. "Hold him here," she said. "Let's reassess." The resident protested softly, but Sarah's tone brooked no argument. Minutes stretched. Ethan felt the weight of waiting settle over him, the same heaviness he remembered from nights spent listening for breath beneath rubble. Then the patient's monitor dipped sharply, alarms cutting through the room. Chaos snapped into focus. Sarah moved with practiced speed, hands steady, voice firm. Shadow remained still, unflinching amid the noise, his presence grounding rather than disruptive. The diagnosis came fast, a delayed pneumothorax subtle enough to slip past initial scans. Treated in time, survivable. Missed, fatal. When the crisis eased, Sarah exhaled slowly, shoulders dropping for the first time that night. She looked at Shadow, then at Ethan, something unguarded flickering across her face. "He knew," she said. Ethan swallowed. He usually does. They stood there, the aftermath settling, both aware that a line had been crossed, not one of protocol, but of trust. Later, in the break room that smelled of burnt coffee and disinfectant, Sarah sat with her back against the counter, exhaustion finally claiming her posture. Ethan stood nearby, unsure where he belonged now. Shadow lay between them, head on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. "I lost my younger brother here," Sarah said suddenly, voice low, not asking permission. Different night, different patient. I stepped away for 5 minutes. Her hands clenched, then relaxed. Ethan did not respond with words. He had learned that silence offered honestly was sometimes the only thing that didn't injure further. Outside, snow continued to fall, patient and unrelenting. Inside St. Luke's, a former SEAL, a night shift nurse, and an aging German shepherd sat in the quiet after the storm, none of them ready to leave, all of them aware that something had begun, something that would ask them to stay longer than comfort allowed. The storm that night did not announce itself with drama. It settled over Spokane like a held breath, snow thickening the dark, until the windows of St. Luke's Medical Center blurred into pale mirrors. Inside the hospital kept its own weather machines, humming voices low, the steady rhythm of work that refused to sleep. Ethan Brooks lingered near the edge of the ward long after the crisis from earlier had resolved, aware of the familiar pull to leave before attachments formed and the unfamiliar counterpull urging him to stay. Shadow lay at his feet, 9 years old, and heavy with experience, sable coat dulled by age, but eyes still sharp, his breathing, even his presence, a quiet vote cast without words. Sarah Mitchell moved through the corridor with a tired grace, slim frame wrapped in scrubs that never quite fit her shoulders. Auburn hair slipping free in soft strands that caught the light. Up close, Ethan noticed how she held her jaw when thinking tight, controlled, like someone who had learned to keep grief from spilling into public spaces. Her skin was pale with a constant warmth at the cheeks, freckles faint beneath the harsh glow, and when she paused to speak with staff, her voice remained steady even when her hands betrayed fatigue. She stopped near Ethan, offered a paper cup of coffee that smelled faintly burned. "You don't have to stay," she said, not unkindly. Ethan nodded, accepting the cup anyway. "I know," he replied. Neither moved. The hospital's night supervisor appeared, then a woman Ethan hadn't met. Dr. Lillian Rowe, early 50s, tall and angular, with iron-gray hair cut short for efficiency, her white coat creased at the elbows from years of leaning into problems rather than away from them. Her face bore fine lines carved by long decisions and longer consequences. Her eyes were sharp but not cold, the gaze of someone who valued competence above comfort. She took in Ethan, Shadow, and Sarah with a single assessing look. The dog, she said, tone neutral. Sarah met her gaze. "He flagged a delayed pneumothorax," she answered. Dr. Rowe's eyebrows lifted a fraction. "So I heard," she said, then turned to Ethan. "Your partner is welcome tonight. Protocols bend when lives don't." Ethan felt a small, unexpected easing in his chest. The next hours unfolded without spectacle. Ethan watched the way Sarah worked when the pace slowed, how she checked IV lines twice, how she spoke to patients even when they were sedated, how she carried a quiet respect into rooms that had already taken too much. Shadow followed her movements like a shadow earned rather than given, positioning himself where he could see and smell without interfering, rising only when something in the air shifted. Near dawn, a new patient arrived without sirens. Caleb Horn, late 20s, thin and hollow-eyed, hoodie pulled tight around a narrow frame, hands trembling as if cold lived inside his bones. His face was angular with a soft beard he'd failed to maintain, eyes darting at corners that offered no exits. Sarah took him in, voice gentle but firm, noting his vitals, his shallow breaths. Ethan recognized the posture, the way Caleb held himself, half-turned, ready to flee. Shadow stood ears forward, then did something unusual. He moved closer, slow and deliberate, and sat beside the gurney without touching. Caleb froze. Is he going to?" he began. Sarah shook her head. "He's trained," she said. "He stays unless you ask him not to." Caleb's shoulders sagged an inch. "I don't mind," he whispered. Shadow lowered his head, breathing steady. Ethan saw it then, the way Shadow wasn't signaling danger but offering a boundary, a calm that said, "You're seen." Later, when tests revealed dehydration and acute anxiety rather than something more lethal, Sarah guided Caleb to observation. He watched Shadow with a childlike focus. "He doesn't leave," Caleb said, voice cracking. Ethan answered before Sarah could. "He stays," he said simply. The word landed with weight neither of them commented on. In the break room, under lights too bright for rest, Sarah finally sat. She pressed her palms together, flexed her fingers as if warming them over memory. "My brother," she said again, not looking at Ethan this time. "Daniel. 22. He worked nights at a warehouse south of town. Forklift accident." Her voice did not waver, but her shoulders did. "I was on shift here. I stepped away to cry in the stairwell because I thought I'd be stronger if I came back composed." She swallowed. "He died while I was gone." Ethan listened, the old ache surfacing, the catalog of moments he wished he'd chosen differently. "I learned something," Sarah continued, lifting her eyes. "Leaving doesn't make the pain smaller. It just makes it lonelier." Shadow shifted closer, resting his head against her shin. Permission earned, rather than assumed. The hospital stirred as morning approached. Dr. Rowe returned, offered Ethan a measured nod. "If you're willing," she said, "we could use you and your partner again. Not as a novelty, as presence." Ethan hesitated, the habit of retreat pressing against the unfamiliar pull of usefulness. He thought of the nights he'd walked away because staying felt like drowning. He looked down at Shadow, muzzle gray eyes patient. "We can stay," Ethan said. The word felt heavier than yes, more honest than sure. When the first light filtered through the windows, softening the edges of the night, Ethan walked with Shadow to the entrance. He meant to leave, then meant to promise nothing, but Sarah stood at the desk, auburn hair now fully loose, freckles bright in the dawn. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked, half a question, half a hope. She didn't dress up. Ethan considered the city waking outside the quiet after the storm. "We'll be here," he said. Shadow's tail thumped once decisive, and in that small commitment made without ceremony, something in all three of them chose to stay. Morning did not rush Spokane awake. It arrived cautiously, pale light seeping through clouds thinned by the night's storm, leaving the streets damp and quiet. Inside St. Luke's Medical Center, the day shift began its slow handover, and with it came the subtle friction of change. New voices, new faces, the same burdens carried forward. Ethan Brooks returned just before noon, coat still dusted with melting snow. Shadow pacing at his side with the practiced calm of an old professional who understood that work did not always announce itself loudly. Ethan looked more worn in daylight, the angular lines of his face softened by fatigue, beard, thicker now with gray, threading through dark eyes. Steady but carrying a guarded distance that came from years of watching things end without ceremony. He moved through the hospital with restraint, aware of the weight his presence carried without uniform or badge, guided instead by Shadow's quiet authority. Sarah Mitchell met them near the observation wing, her posture straighter than it had been at dawn, though the tiredness remained etched beneath her eyes. In daylight, her auburn hair caught hints of copper where it escaped its loose tie freckles, standing out against skin still flushed from long hours under fluorescent lights. She was slim, almost delicate in frame, but her movements carried assurance born of repetition and resolve. She had learned to function with grief, seated beside her rather than banished. "We've got someone I want you to meet," she said, voice low, professional, but threaded with something cautious. She led them to a quiet room where the hum of machines softened into background breath. The patient inside was Margaret Hale, late 60s, small and bird-like beneath hospital blankets, silver hair cut short and brushed neatly despite the circumstances. Her skin was thin and translucent, eyes a clear, searching blue that held a lifetime of observation. Margaret had been admitted for cardiac monitoring after a near syncope episode, but what lingered heavier than her arrhythmia was the loneliness she wore openly. When Shadow stepped into the room, Margaret's gaze fixed on him with immediate interest. "You brought a soldier," she said, voice dry but amused. Ethan felt a flicker of surprise. Sarah smiled faintly. "Margaret was a Navy wife," she explained. 30 years. Margaret reached out a hand, veins prominent beneath papery skin, stopping short of contact until Shadow leaned in to sniff. He allowed her touch-tail thumping once, a soft sound against the linoleum. "Good dog," Margaret murmured. "You've got the eyes of one who's waited." Ethan pulled a chair closer, listening as Margaret spoke not of pain, but of absence. Her husband had died 2 years earlier, a quiet mourning that left the house too large and the days unstructured. "People think grief is loud," she said, fingers resting in Shadow's fur. "But it's mostly the quiet rooms that do the damage." Shadow lay down beside her bed, chin on his paws, presence filling the space where words faltered. Later, as Sarah charted notes at the desk, a man hovered uncertainly near the doorway. Thomas Reed, early 40s, tall but stooped, hair thinning at the temples, jaw unshaven as if sleep had been a luxury denied. He wore a windbreaker too light for the season, and held himself like someone bracing for bad news, even when none had yet arrived. Sarah greeted him gently. Thomas was Margaret's son, visiting between shifts at a distribution center outside town. His eyes flicked to Shadow with guarded curiosity. "She likes dogs," he said, voice rough with worry. Ethan nodded. "They like her," he replied. The exchange was small, but Thomas's shoulders eased a fraction as he watched his mother's hand steady against Shadow's warmth. The afternoon deepened, and with it came a different kind of tension. A code blue echoed faintly down the hall. Not Margaret's room, but close enough to draw breath short. Sarah moved instinctively toward the sound, Ethan rising without thinking. Old habits reasserting themselves. Shadow stood alert, scanning. The code resolved quickly, a save messy but successful, and the hospital exhaled. In the aftermath, Sarah leaned against the wall outside the room, eyes closed for a beat longer than necessary. Ethan stood beside her, not intruding, not leaving. "You don't have to do that," she said quietly, meaning more than one thing. Ethan considered the floor, the faint scuffs of countless hurried steps. "I do," he answered. Shadow shifted closer, his flank brushing Sarah's calf, grounding without demand. As evening approached, Margaret slept more peacefully than she had since admission. Thomas thanked Ethan awkwardly, gratitude clumsy but sincere, then left for work, trusting the quiet room to hold until morning. "Doctor." Lillian Rowe passed by once more, paused at the doorway, and nodded approval without ceremony. "Presence," she said, as if confirming a theory. When visiting hours ended, Sarah hesitated. "We'll need to keep this appropriate," she said, gesturing between Ethan and Shadow, professional lines clear, even as something personal threaded beneath. Ethan nodded, understanding boundaries better than most. "We'll come when invited," he said. Night gathered again, softer this time. As Ethan and Shadow prepared to leave, Margaret stirred. "You'll come back?" she said, not asking. Ethan met her gaze. "Yes," he replied, the word no longer heavy but settled. Outside, the city breathed under clearing skies. Ethan walked with Shadow toward the truck, aware that the hospital had given him something he had not known how to ask for: a room where breath could be held safely shared without judgment. And tomorrow he would return, not because he was needed in the way he once had been, but because staying had begun to matter. The call came just after sunset, when Spokane's sky turned the color of bruised steel, and the streets reflected orange light like shallow water. Ethan Brooks had been home less than an hour, boots still by the door jacket hanging where he could grab it again without thinking. Shadow stood before him, 9 years old, and solid as a promised sable coat darkened by age muzzle, graying into something gentle rather than diminished. The phone vibrated, and Ethan answered before it finished the second ring. Sarah Mitchell's voice carried urgency without panic, a practiced steadiness honed by too many nights where fear had to wait its turn. "We've got an incoming mass casualty," she said. "Old rail spur collapsed near the river. EMS is diverting to us." Ethan didn't ask if he should come. He asked where to stage. When he arrived, the hospital's front drive churned with motion ambulances, idling doors, opening voices overlapping into a low roar of purpose. Sarah met him near the intake corridor, her slim frame squared by resolve, auburn hair pulled back tight. This time, freckles bright against skin, flushed from exertion. She wore exhaustion like a second uniform and moved through it anyway. "We'll keep him out of the bays unless I ask," she said, eyes flicking to Shadow. "But stay close." Shadow's ears were up, posture alert without strain, the way he got when the air itself carried information. The first gurney rolled in, bearing a man coated in silt and blood, then another, then another. A new figure stepped into Ethan's peripheral vision, Lieutenant Aaron Pike, late 30s, tall and narrow, with a hawk-like face and close-cropped blonde hair, jaw set with the impatience of command. His turnout coat was smeared with mud, helmet tucked under one arm, eyes scanning for order in the chaos. "We've got 3 still unaccounted for," he said to no one and everyone. "Riverbanks unstable. Secondary collapse possible." Ethan felt the old switch flip, not adrenaline, not bravado, but a narrowing of focus. Shadow took 2 steps toward Pike, then stopped, head angled, nose lifting as if the walls were porous. Sarah noticed. She always noticed. "He's catching something," she said. Pike frowned, skeptical but listening. "Air currents," Ethan said quietly. "Or something else." Another gurney arrived, carrying Maya Lopez, mid-20s, EMS paramedic with dark hair, braided tight brown skin streaked with grime, eyes bright with competence, sharpened by fear. 2 pulled from a void under the platform, she said, breathless. "But there's space beyond the collapse." We heard tapping before the bank shifted. Shadow let out a low sound, not a bark, a vibration that lived in the chest. He moved toward the far corridor leading to imaging, then stopped again as if blocked by an invisible line. Ethan knelt, resting a hand against Shadow's shoulder, feeling the tremor of contained urgency. "He wants to go where sound carries," Ethan said. "Quiet places." Sarah weighed the hallway, the beds filling fast, the thin margin between help and harm. She made a choice. "Observation wing," she said. "Now." They moved without announcement, Pike following Maya at his shoulder. The observation wing was quieter by design, rooms, spaced walls thicker. Shadow walked straight to a closed door and sat, eyes fixed. Inside lay a man not yet triaged. Calvin Moore, early 40s construction foreman, by the look of him broad shoulders compressed into stillness, beard matted with dust, chest rising shallow and uneven. His vitals were deceptively calm. Shadow circled once and lay down with his head near the man's ribs, breathing slow, counting something humans couldn't see. Ethan listened, pressing his ear to the doorframe, and there it was, faint, irregular knocking, not from the room, but from beyond it, as if the building itself remembered the sound. Pike's skepticism cracked into focus. "There's a void behind that wall," he said. "Old service corridor." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Get facilities," she ordered. "Careful access." Time stretched thin and sharp. Facilities arrived with measured steps. Ron Alvarez, mid-50s, compact and sturdy with a mustache gone silver, hands steady from decades of fixing what others forgot existed. He listened, nodded, and began marking the wall with chalk, mapping memory into action. When the panel came free, cold air breathed into the corridor, carrying damp and fear. A voice followed, hoarse and stubborn. "Don't leave." Shadow surged forward but stopped at Ethan's knee, waiting. Ethan spoke into the opening voice, low, grounded. "We're here. Stay still." The rescue unfolded in inches and minutes rather than heroics. A young man emerged first, coughing alive. Then another. The third took longer. Eli Warren, 19-rail apprentice, thin as a reed with dirt ground into his hair and tears cutting clean tracks through grime. He clutched Shadow's fur when he reached the light, fingers shaking, breath breaking. Shadow stood like a wall, letting himself be held, age and patience doing what training could not teach. When it was done, when the count matched the fear, the hospital exhaled. Pike clasped Ethan's forearm grip, hard and grateful. "You and your partner," he said. "You changed the outcome." Ethan shook his head. "We stayed," he replied. Sarah leaned against the counter, eyes closed for a beat, then open again, resolute. "Staying matters," she said, as if confirming a truth now tested by weight. Later, as night settled back into its quieter register, Sarah found Ethan by the windows. "We need to formalize this," she said. "Not as spectacle, as service." Ethan thought of the rooms that held breath of shadow, choosing where to lie of the thin line between leaving and loss. "We'll be here," he said again, and this time it felt like a plan. Shadow's tail thumped once decisive, and the hospital carried on, steadied by the knowledge that when the ground shifted without warning, someone would stay. The days after the rail spur collapse did not slow the hospital so much as they rearranged it. Spokane returned to its winter rhythm, cold mornings, brittle sunlight, the river carrying on, as if it had not tried to swallow men whole. But inside St. Luke's, something subtle had shifted. Ethan Brooks felt it the moment he walked through the doors with Shadow at his side, the way conversations paused half a beat longer, the way eyes tracked the German shepherd not with curiosity now, but with expectation. Ethan noticed the change in himself as well. He stood straighter without intending to, shoulders squared, not by rank or uniform, but by responsibility rediscovered. At 42, the years showed more clearly in daylight, faint lines carved at the edges of his eyes, beard thickened and uneven with gray hands marked by old fractures and newer stiffness. Yet there was steadiness in him that had been absent when he first returned from service, a sense that he was no longer hovering at the edge of things. Sarah Mitchell met them near the conference room that afternoon, her slim figure wrapped in a soft gray sweater instead of scrubs, auburn hair worn loose over one shoulder, the color deepened by winter light. Out of uniform, she looked younger, more vulnerable, freckles bright against pale skin, but the calm in her green eyes remained unchanged. She held a clipboard to her chest like a shield she no longer fully needed. "They want to talk," she said simply, nodding toward the room. Inside waited Dr. Lillian Rowe and a handful of department heads, including Mark Delaney from trauma, and a woman Ethan hadn't met before, Janice Cooper, early 40s. Hospital operations manager, neatly dressed, posture precise. Dark hair cut in a sharp bob that framed a face trained to balance empathy with efficiency. Her expression was polite but appraising, the look of someone accustomed to deciding whether something fit within policy or needed to be reshaped. Shadow lay down near the wall without prompting, his aging body folding with practiced care, ears alert. The discussion was measured, careful. They spoke of liability, of patient comfort, of protocols. Ethan listened more than he spoke, jaw set, eyes steady, aware that his instinct to push would only harden resistance. Sarah, however, surprised him. She spoke with clarity that carried quiet authority, explaining how Shadow's presence had changed rooms, how patients settled, how staff moved with more focus when calm replaced panic. Dr. Rowe added her weight without embellishment. "We don't need spectacle," she said. "We need presence." Janice Cooper's pen paused. She looked from Shadow to Ethan. "We'll pilot it," she decided. "Limited hours, supervised, documented." Ethan nodded once. It was more than he had expected. That evening, as the hospital eased into another night shift, the cost of staying made itself known. Shadow moved slower, joints stiffening after long hours on tile. Ethan noticed immediately, kneeling to massage the dog's shoulders with practiced care. Shadow's coat had thinned slightly along the hips, the sable darkening around a spine that carried more winters than it once had. He leaned into Ethan's hands with a soft sigh, trusting without question. Sarah watched from the nurse's station, concern tightening her features. "He's not young," she said gently. Ethan's mouth curved in a faint smile. "Neither am I," he replied. The night brought a different kind of test. Not sirens, not collapse, but a patient who refused help. Raymond Klein, mid-50s, broad-shouldered and weathered skin leathered by years of outdoor labor, beard gone wild in neglect. He had come in intoxicated, belligerent, words sharp with anger that masked fear. His history spilled out in fragments. Job lost, marriage, ended, sleep, haunted by memories he wouldn't name. He paced his room like a caged thing, voice rising, fists clenching. Staff hovered cautious. Ethan stood at the threshold, reading posture and breath the way he had read rooms overseas. Shadow stayed at heel, calm as stone. Raymond's eyes flicked to the dog, then back to Ethan. "You think that mutt scares me?" he snapped. Ethan shook his head. "He's not here for that," he said quietly. Shadow stepped forward only when Ethan did. stopping a respectful distance away. He sat. He waited. The silence stretched. Raymond's shoulders sagged as if a weight had finally found the floor. He dropped onto the bed, face in his hands, voice breaking without warning. "I can't keep doing this," he whispered. Shadow did not move. He did not need to. Afterward, when Raymond slept under observation, Sarah leaned against the wall beside Ethan. Exhaustion etched deeper now. "Staying isn't free," she said, eyes fixed on the floor. Ethan nodded. He felt it in his bones, in the ache of old injuries, flaring in the way memories pressed closer when he allowed himself to stop moving. He also felt the counterweight, the quiet satisfaction of choosing not to leave. Near dawn, as snow began again in soft sheets, Ethan took Shadow outside for air. The city was hushed, streetlights haloed in white. Shadow lifted his nose, testing the cold, then sat leaning lightly against Ethan's leg. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's head, feeling the warmth beneath fur gone thin with age. "We'll pace it," he murmured. More promise than plan. Inside, Sarah watched through the glass, her reflection overlaying the two silhouettes. She understood then that staying would ask more of all of them than heroics ever had. It would ask restraint, patience, the humility to know when to step back and when to step in. When Ethan returned, Janice Cooper was waiting with a stack of forms and a measured smile. "We'll start tomorrow," she said. "Short shifts." Ethan signed where indicated the pen heavy in his hand. Shadow's tail thumped once, slow but certain. The hospital lights dimmed to night mode, and with them the understanding settled. Staying had a weight, but it was a weight they were choosing together. The power failed without ceremony. A sudden hollowing of sound as the hum that defined St. Luke's Medical Center vanished and the corridors inhaled at once. Spokane's winter pressed close to the windows, wind worrying the frames, snow piling into soft drifts that swallowed street noise. Emergency lights blinked on in strips of amber, throwing long shadows that reshaped familiar halls into something older and less forgiving. Ethan Brooks felt the shift in his bones before anyone spoke, the old readiness, waking without adrenaline, posture tightening as his breath slowed. He stood taller in the half-light, beard shadowing a jaw cut by years of restraint, eyes steady and assessing. Shadow 9 and graying at the muzzle rose with care beside him, joints stiff but resolve intact, sable coat catching the emergency glow in bands of bronze and black. Sarah Mitchell crossed the corridor at a brisk walk. Slim frame, decisive, even in darkness. Auburn hair pulled back but already loosening at the temples, freckles stark against pale skin, warmed by exertion. Her green eyes scanned monitors running on backup, her voice calm as she coordinated staff, the steadiness of someone who had learned to lead by lowering the room's pulse rather than raising her own. "Generators are up," she said, meeting Ethan's gaze. "ICU's stable. Pediatrics needs eyes." They moved together without discussion. The pediatric wing carried a different quiet, one made fragile by small breaths and softer fears. Shadow slowed, scenting the air, choosing his steps with care. A new figure hovered near a doorway. Nora Whitman, early 30s, pediatric respiratory therapist, petite with a strong jaw and cropped dark hair, eyes alert behind square glasses that reflected the emergency lights. Her hands were steady, but her shoulders betrayed tension earned by responsibility. "We've got a kid to Sadding," she said, voice clipped. "Equipment's fine. He's panicking." Inside the room lay Lucas Reed, 8 years old, all elbows and knees beneath a blanket printed with faded stars, skin-flushed chest fluttering like a trapped bird. His hair stuck up in uneven tufts, eyes too bright with fear. Ethan stayed near the door frame, giving space while Shadow sat where the boy could see him, ears relaxed, posture open. Lucas's breathing hitched, then slowed a fraction as his gaze fixed on the dog. "Is he real?" Lucas whispered. Sarah crouched, her voice softening without losing authority. "He's real," she said. "And he stays." Shadow lowered himself to the floor, chin on paws, a living metronome. Lucas mirrored the rhythm, breath finding breath. In the hall, voices rose and fell, updates, reroutes, reassurances. The outage stretched minutes into an hour. Snow thickened, wind moaned. Ethan felt the weight of staying settle heavier now, not as a vow, but as a sequence of choices made in low light. When Lucas stabilized, Nora exhaled a small smile breaking through her professional shell. "He's got a gift," she said, nodding to Shadow. Ethan shrugged. "He listens," he replied. The next call came from the surgical floor where a patient had become combative in the dark. They arrived to find Henry Collins, early 60s, tall and sinewy with a hawk nose and iron-gray stubble. Former machinist by the look of his hands, fingers thickened by decades of work. His eyes darted confusion edged with anger. A head injury complicated by the blackout had stripped away his bearings. Staff hovered at a distance, careful. Ethan approached slowly, palms visible, Shadow at heel. "Henry," Ethan said, grounding his voice. "You're safe." Henry's gaze snagged on Shadow. The dog did not advance. He waited. The man's shoulders dropped an inch, then another. "Lights went out," Henry muttered. "Thought I was back at the plant." Sarah stepped in, laying a hand on the rail, her presence a constant. "You're here," she said. "We're not leaving." The words did the work. Sedation could not. Outside, generators thrummed a low promise, returning. The lights came back in stages, white, reclaiming amber corners, smoothing into known shapes. Relief passed through the building like a tide pulling back. Ethan noticed it in the way shoulders unknotted, in the way laughter, brief and disbelieving, escaped the staff. Shadow sagged, then the effort leaving him all at once. Ethan knelt, fingers finding the familiar knots along the dog's shoulders, massaging gently. Shadow leaned into him, breath-warm eyes half-lidded. Sarah watched, concern threading her features. "We'll shorten nights," she said. "We'll listen when he says enough." Ethan nodded, gratitude quiet and deep. In the break room, Janice Cooper appeared with a clipboard bob neat, even after the outage, expression softened by outcome. "Good work," she said. "All of you." Her eyes lingered on Shadow. "We'll adjust the pilot. Daytime emphasis. Nights as needed." It felt like wisdom earned, not concession. As dawn edged the sky with pale blue, Ethan walked Shadow outside for air. Snow had stilled the city, hushed under a clean sheet. Shadow sat leaning lightly against Ethan's leg weight, familiar and finite. Ethan rested his palm on the graying head, feeling the thrum of life steady and true. Inside, Sarah stood by the window silhouette framed by returning light. She understood the night had asked something specific of them, and found them willing. When Ethan re-entered, she met him with a look that held relief and resolve in equal measure. "We did it," she said. Ethan shook his head, a small smile breaking through. "We stayed," he replied. And in the quiet after the storm, with the lights restored and the rooms breathing easier, staying felt less like defiance and more like care, measured and shared, ready for whatever the next darkness might bring. Spring reached Spokane the way forgiveness often does, quietly, without announcement, melting the edges of what winter had hardened. The river loosened the streets, shed their gray crust, and light lingered a little longer in the evenings. At St. Luke's Medical Center, the seasons changed less dramatically, but the difference was felt all the same. The halls breathed easier. Laughter, tentative at first, found room between beeping monitors and rolling carts. Ethan Brooks noticed it on a Tuesday morning when he arrived with Shadow and realized he no longer paused at the threshold. He was still tall and broad-shouldered, the angles of his face softened by time and trimmed beard threaded with gray, but the guarded distance in his eyes had eased. He moved through the building with a purpose that did not come from command or crisis, but from belonging. Shadow walked at his side, 9 years old and slower now, sable coat warmed by sun through glass muzzle silvered into gentleness. His gait had shortened, joints stiffening on cool mornings, but his eyes remained bright and attentive, choosing where to be with a wisdom earned by staying. Sarah Mitchell met them near the atrium where sunlight spilled across the floor in wide bands. She wore a simple blue dress beneath a white cardigan. Auburn hair cut shorter now to rest just above her shoulders, the color catching copper when she turned. Without scrubs, her slim frame looked lighter, freckles vivid against pale skin no longer drawn by exhaustion. The steadiness in her green eyes remained, but it shared space with something new, ease. She smiled without checking who might see. "You're early," she said. Ethan shrugged. "Shadow likes the light," he replied. Shadow, as if in agreement, settled near a planter nose lifted to the faint scent of leaves. The pilot program had become routine then, something quieter and better a rhythm. Daytime hours, planned rest, clear boundaries. Janice Cooper's clipped efficiency had softened into respect, Dr. Lillian Rose measured nods into trust. The hospital had learned how to hold what helped, without asking it to carry more than it could. That morning brought visitors, not emergencies, not codes, but people returning to say things they had not known how to say before. Margaret Hale arrived, first cardigan, neatly buttoned, silver hair brushed smooth, eyes bright. She walked with a cane, now steps careful but confident. "I wanted to see my soldier," she said, patting Shadow's head. Shadow leaned into her hand-tail, thumping once, slow and satisfied. Thomas Reed followed, shoulders no longer hunched, beard-trimmed, gratitude plain. "Mom's been sleeping," he said, voice steady. "Real sleep." In the pediatric wing, Lucas Reed, no relation as it turned out, ran toward them. Starprint blanket traded for a superhero cape, elbows still sharp, but laughter easy. Nora Whitman watched from the doorway, glasses catching the light, a rare grin breaking through her professional reserve. "He asks for the dog," she said. "Every visit." Ethan knelt, letting Lucas hug Shadow's neck, counting breaths the way he had learned to do himself. In the afternoon, a small ceremony gathered near the atrium, not pomp, not press, just staff and families and a table with coffee gone lukewarm because no one remembered to drink it. Dr. Rowe spoke briefly about presence, about the courage to remain when leaving would be easier. Janice Cooper presented a modest plaque, not a medal, but a marker, recognizing the program and the people who shaped it. Ethan listened, hands folded, feeling the words settle without needing to be larger than they were. When it ended, Sarah took his hand. It was simple. It felt like the right size. Later, when the crowd thinned and the hospital returned to its soft afternoon hum, Sarah and Ethan walked Shadow outside to the small garden where benches caught the sun. Spring had coaxed green from the soil, birds argued in the hedges. Shadow eased himself down with a grunt content. Sarah sat beside him, fingers brushing his fur, then looked at Ethan. "He won't be able to do this forever," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. He had learned the shape of that truth. "Neither will I," he replied, then smiled. "But not today." She smiled back, something like relief shining through. A man approached hesitantly. Caleb Horn, thinner still but steadier. Beard, trimmed eyes, clearer. He wore a clean jacket and held himself upright as if trying out a new posture. "I start work Monday," he said, voice careful with hope. "I wanted you to know." Ethan stood, shook his hand. Shadow lifted his head, watching, approving. As evening settled, Sarah and Ethan remained on the bench, sharing the quiet. The city beyond the hospital glowed with a gentler light now. "I used to think staying meant giving something up," Sarah said. "Sleep, distance, safety." Ethan considered the path that had brought him back from war to winter to spring. "I thought leaving was how you survived," he said. Shadow shifted closer, pressing his weight between them, a warm, breathing certainty. "Turns out," Ethan continued, "staying can be how you live." The sun dipped, shadows lengthened, and the garden held them without asking for anything more. When they rose to go, Shadow followed at his own pace, and Ethan matched it unhurried. Inside the hospital, lights brightened against the coming dusk, not as a warning, but as a welcome. Tomorrow would bring work and limits and the honest accounting of age and care. But tonight, in a city learning to thaw a former seal, a nurse who had learned to forgive herself and an old German shepherd chose the same thing they had chosen again and again, to stay together, and let that be enough. At the end of this story, there is a quiet truth worth holding on to. Sometimes the miracle is not thunder or light from the sky, but the simple grace of staying when leaving would be easier. Perhaps God does not always part seas or stop storms. Perhaps He places the right souls beside us at the right moment. A loyal dog, a steady hand, a calm voice in the dark, and waits to see if we will choose love over fear. In daily life, miracles often look ordinary: listening, instead of turning away, offering patience when the world feels heavy, showing up for someone who cannot ask for help. If this story touched your heart, may it remind you that God is present in the small choices you make every day, and that your presence can be someone else's answered prayer. Please share this story with someone who might need hope tonight. Leave a comment about where you are watching from or what part moved you most, and subscribe to the channel so more stories of faith, healing, and second chances can reach others. May God bless you, protect you, and fill your days with peace, courage, and quiet miracles. Amen.